Good evening, and a warm welcome to everyone who has joined us for tonight's panel on critical race theory, both in person and virtually. And for those of you who are joining virtually, I want to please have you note that there will be closed captions and a sign language interpreter for this event. My name is Andrea Taylor, and I'm Boston University's Senior Diversity Officer, and we are so pleased to present this program during Black History Month, which has been nationally recognized since 1976, in collaboration with the Boston University School of Law, Wheelock College of Education and Human Development, the School of Public Health, and the Howard Thurman Center for Common Ground. Our goal this evening is to engage in an educational conversation from a multidisciplinary perspective that seeks to provide context, clarity, and resources to deepen our knowledge and understanding of critical race theory, a complex topic related to legal scholarship and an academic movement at the intersection of race and U.S. law that challenges mainstream American approaches to social justice. As a university, we're preparing the next generation of students to enter an increasingly dynamic and diverse society and work culture. We believe, that it's important to offer opportunities for an informed dialogue to review this complex topic, and we invite everyone in the live and virtual audience to reflect, probe, and be open to new ideas. We are very fortunate to have a multidisciplinary panel to facilitate this dialogue within the BU community and beyond. And without further ado, I'd like to introduce you to our panelists and our moderator for this evening. Angela Onwuachi-Willig is the Dean, and Ryan Roth Gallo and Ernest J. Gallo Professor of Law at Boston University School of Law, and she is a renowned legal scholar and an expert in critical race theory, a social justice advocate, and employment discrimination and family law. Dr. Janet Dewar Bell is a lifelong social justice advocate as well, a civil rights movement veteran, and a communications expert with a doctorate in leadership and change from Antioch University. Next, we have Dr. Laura M. Jiménez, who is BU Wheelock's Associate Dean of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion, and a senior lecturer in BU Wheelock's Language and Literacy Department. By studying both literature and literacy, she focuses on the ways that teachers engage with the systems of inequity in the education field and their roles within those systems. Finally, Dr. Craig Andrade, who is an Associate Dean of Practice and Associate Professor of Community Health and Director of the Activist Lab at Boston University. The Activist Lab serves as a catalyst for bold public health by connecting students, faculty, staff, and community partners with the knowledge and experiences that allow them to face each injustice as an opportunity to rectify or dismantle the systems that create inequity. So before we begin our panel discussion, I'd like to welcome Dean Angela Onwuachi-Willig to the stage to provide us with an educational overview of critical race theory. Dean Ann.
Thank you so much. I want to begin by thanking Senior Diversity Officer Andrea Taylor for organizing, and her team. Her entire team is an amazing team for organizing a really fantastic program. And of course, thanking my wonderful co-panelists for really helping to educate us all about CRT, critical race theory. I want to again emphasize that the purpose of this program is really to educate. It's not a partisan panel. We're not trying to inform you what side you should take. We're simply disseminating knowledge on this panel. We're not here to debate the merits of CRT, but we're just taking as Andrea Taylor pointed out, we're taking our mission as an educational institution really important, and we have a responsibility to educate everybody in one of the most prominent debates that's occurring in our country right now. I want to encourage everyone to put their questions, who is signing in remotely, to put their questions in the Q&A section. And we welcome questions from all participants in this program, but we'll be prioritizing questions from students when we can. So let me tell you a little bit about CRT. Critical race theory, it's a movement by activists, by scholars who are interested in studying and transforming the relationship between race, racism, power, and the law. When you're studying CRT, you're doing a variety of things. And one of the things you're doing is thinking critically about forms of racial subordination in our nation's history, particularly as they relate to the development and application of the law. You're analyzing how legal institutions create and maintain racial hierarchies and disparities, and comparing related legal and social subordination along other axes of identity, like gender, ability, things of that nature. So what is racism might be one of the things that you would say when we're talking about critical race theory. Critical race theory examines the relationship and the interaction of racism in all of its forms with the law. So for example, critical race theory explores what's called Jim Crow racism, which is an overt racist ideology that contends that the social and economic standing of people of color is the result of their biological, intellectual, and moral inferiority. Jim Crow racism is actually the type of racism that most people think of when they say the word racism. It's explicit and it's rooted in this idea of a person or individual with bad intent, a bad actor is what we would often say in the law. Critical race theory, however, teaches us that racism is far more complicated. Racism is persistent and pervasive even without bad actors. So one particular kind of racism we look at that we have even without bad actors is colorblind racism, common sense racism. That is an ideology whereby individuals rationalize racial disparities and inequities as being the result of market dynamics, naturally occurring phenomena, and the imputed cultural limitations of particular racial groups. So an example of colorblind racism might be that people would say, well, we're not segregated in the places we live because of racism. We're segregated because people just tend to live near people who are like them. They're rationalizing racism away in a particular way, rationalizing something that's been caused by a variety of social structures away. And contrary to what some have said, critical race theory does not contend that a person is inherently racist or oppressive because of their race. Again, critical race theory is not generally focused on individual bad actors, and it recognizes that this type of explicit racism, whether it's Jim Crow racism, that's a learned kind of racism, even colorblind racism. But even more important, critical race theory is an analytical frame that stresses that racism goes beyond individual explicit prejudice and implicit bias. As Professor Tanya Hernandez of Fordham Law School has explained, critical race theory recognizes that racism is systemically embedded in laws, policies, and institutions that uphold and reproduce racial inequalities. And in that sense, critical race theory primarily focuses on structural racism. And so structural racism is a social structure in which adopted and enacted policies, practices, cultures, and other norms both produce and reinforce racial inequities. It's racial bias that is literally built into and across institutions and structures in our society. It's a system of policies, practices, cultural representations, and norms that systemically privilege white people and that routinely disadvantage people of color. Right. So I want to introduce you to a few core concepts of critical theory, core principles, core tenets of critical race theory before we move on. All right, so one essential feature of critical race theory is an understanding that racism is not aberrational. It's not out of the ordinary in our country's history or its present. It is business as usual in this country, and the racial disparities that we see in our country are the result of decades of racialized laws, policies, and practices that continue to influence and shape the lives of people according to their racial background or their racial identity. Another important tenet of critical race theory is that racial subordination serves both psychic and material purposes for the dominant group. So racial subordination is about more than just disparities in wages or disparities in access to jobs, access to healthcare, and other types of material benefits. It's also about what W.E.B. Du Bois and Cheryl Harris have called the psychological wages of whiteness, meaning the meager compensation for some of knowing that they are not at the bottom of the social hierarchy as long as those people, for example, Blacks, are there. So perhaps African-American comedian Chris Rock made this point clearest when he quipped during one of his comedy routines, quote, "There ain't a white man in this room that would change places with me. None of you would change places with me, and I'm rich," right? Another core tenet of critical race theory is that race is not biological. Rather, race is socially constructed. So according to sociologists Michael Omi and Howard Wynant, race is created, inhabited, shaped, and transformed by social, historical, and political forces. And all of that in turn creates meaning or meanings that are then attached to different racial groups, right? So it's about the meanings that are social meanings that are attached to particular racial groups. One of the ways in which we know that race is socially constructed is if it was really true, it was biological, it would be defined in the same way across all countries. But if you look at different countries, different people who might be in one racial group in one country are in an entirely different racial group in another country. So for example, somebody who would be considered to be Black in the United States might be considered in a category that doesn't even exist here in the United States. In South Africa, a racial category that's called colored. Right? But sometimes people will say, well, if race is not real, why don't we just stop paying attention to it? Why don't we just ignore it? And the fact that race is socially constructed doesn't mean that there aren't consequences that come with it. So for example, take a dollar bill, right? The money that we use to buy things doesn't have any inherent meaning. It's socially constructed. We've given it that meaning. But it doesn't mean that I can write $1 on this piece of paper and then go to a store and try to spend it. There are consequences that come with it. Another core principle of CRT is that colorblindness cannot end racism. So instead, colorblindness actually reifies racism. Ignoring race actually can reify racism. Current legal doctrine assumes that colorblindness is the most effective means for combating and eliminating racial discrimination, subordination, and their effects. As the law currently stands, efforts on the part of public schools and colleges and universities to racially integrate or diversify their student bodies is subject to the same judicial skepticism, the same judicial scrutiny as efforts on the part of those same institutions, if they were trying to do so, to racially segregate those students. So from the court's perspective, because both integration initiatives and segregation initiatives necessarily rely on race, because they rely on race, both should be treated as suspect and therefore subject to the court's most exacting scrutiny, which is something in law called strict scrutiny. Critical race theory critiques this approach. It critiques what Professor Ian Haney-Lopez calls the court's intentional blindness with respect to the ongoing realities of race. And it does so by highlighting how race remains a salient feature in all aspects of our society. Critical race theorists ask, how can one meaningfully address racial inequality without explicitly invoking race and directly targeting racial inequality? So imagine trying to diagnose and medically treat cancer by taking a cancer-blind approach. How would that even work, right? Would anyone seriously support a rule that prohibited doctors or researchers from either talking about cancer or directly targeting the disease for its eradication? And yet that's what the law expects us to do with race. Another core principle of critical race theory is that different racial groups are racialized in different ways. So the discrimination and bias that African Americans may face, for example, may differ from the discrimination and bias that Asian Americans may face. For example, African Americans tend to not be viewed as perpetual foreigners in the United States. And yet many Asian Americans are often asked, well, after responding to where are you from, and the person says, I'm from Michigan. No, where are you really from, right? It's a form of bias and discrimination based upon a stereotype that is applied to Asian Americans. It's not applied to African Americans. Doesn't mean that the groups don't discriminate. All groups experience discrimination and bias, but just in different ways at times. Another core principle of critical race theory is that people of color have a unique voice due to their experiences with race and racism. We experience life in different ways, in part because of our race. And that means that we may look at the same events and understand them differently. We make the same events, the same laws, the same interpretations, and view them differently. So take, for example, policing. If you look at any Pew Research report on policing, you'll see the disparities in how whites and blacks, for example, view policing. And that view shapes the kinds of laws that people might support, the kinds of policies that people might support or not support. It shapes how people might see a video of a particular killing. And so it's important, the critical race theory says that it's important to pay attention to the voices of people of color because those voices have traditionally been ignored, and there's a unique perspective that is being brought based upon the experiences of racism. Another core principle is that no person has a single, easily stated unitary identity. And this idea is basically the concept behind both anti-essentialism and intersectionality. Anti-essentialism is the notion that there's no essential woman, for example, or no essential black person. But the way that gets defined, often when people are talking about women, they're imagining a white woman, or sometimes when people are talking about Black civil rights, they're imagining a black man. And anti-essentialism says that we've got to work against trying to fit everybody in a really diverse and group all into one category, and then assuming that they all have the same experiences. It doesn't mean that essentialism is always bad. Sometimes it's good. Sometimes you need essentialism for people to kind of feel connected and gather around a particular issue. Intersectionality recognizes that people experience, again, life differently at the intersection of different categories. So imagine a firm that has 4 black male partners, a law firm that has 4 black male partners, but it's never had black women ever ascend to a partnership. It doesn't mean that that firm isn't discriminating against black women, because black women might be experiencing the world and that workplace differently based on the intersection of race and gender. The final tenet I'll introduce you to is that CRT endorses a multidisciplinary approach to scholarship and endorses non-mainstream forms of scholarship like storytelling and narrative. And critical race theorists not only find that these forms also make the law more accessible, but they also believe that these stories are important because they're critical to challenging the kinds of stock narratives, the stock stories that so often appear in the law, by bringing a counter to what's assumed often in so many legal cases. And I believe that's it. A couple of things I want to tell you about, they're kind of emerging concepts, newer concepts in critical race theory. One is critical race empiricism, and it's a notion that there's a lot of work that should be done at the intersection of empirical studies and critical race theory, that empiricists can benefit a lot from the insights of critical race theorists, for example, in how they measure race. Sometimes people will use race and as a one of their variables, and really they're trying to get at something else, right? And so thinking more deeply about what you're trying to measure. Working identity and covering are some of my favorite concepts, and it's a recognition that we all perform our identities. Working identities, if you're a person of color, you're working your identity to avoid the imposition of particular stereotypes on yourself. So imagine, for example, a Black associate at a law firm who says, I know that there's a stereotype that Blacks are lazy. So I'm going to make sure I'm the last person in the office every day. I'm going to be the hardest working person around to counter that stereotype. One of the problems with working one's identity, sometimes it can backfire because people like to rationalize things. Remember common sense racism or colorblind racism? They like to rationalize things in a way that makes sense to them. So they might say, somebody who has a particular view might not say, hey, that's the hardest working person around. They might say, it takes him longer to do the same work that the rest of us do, right? So imagine. Covering is downplaying a disfavored trait. You're not passing, you're not hiding that trait, but you're downplaying it. So imagine somebody who identifies as gay or lesbian and is out in the workplace and is not hiding it, but downplaying it. I don't have pictures of my family on my desk, or I'm laughing at a joke that somebody tells because I'm trying to fit in and make those feel comfortable around me. Those are the kinds of examples of covering. And then racial capitalism is, now we live in a world where people recognize that diversity has value. And so sometimes institutions want to promote diversity in a way without actually doing the work, like without actually doing the work of changing things, right? So we want to highlight all the people that we have around us, of color around us, or we want to do this. Or literally people have been photoshopped into brochures before, things of that nature. So it's kind of taking advantage of what the accepted value of diversity is without doing the work. All right. And so that is my introduction to critical race theory, and I would like to invite our panelists up for a conversation.
I'll put my mask out back there.
So one of the things, we find ourselves in a moment of major backlash on critical race theory. Yeah. We find ourselves where teachers and principals and other people are literally losing their jobs because of this backlash on critical race theory. And one question is, I guess I have two questions. Number one, how do we find ourselves in this particular moment of backlash? And number two, why is it so important for us to be offering a program like this about how to that educates people on what critical race theory is?
Well, there's always a moment of backlash after what we think's progressive activity. That the election of Barack Obama, which most of us celebrated, that very night that he was inaugurated, some people went to work to try to dismantle the things that they thought he might want to develop in his administration. And since then, since he's not been in office, you see that the backlash really has ramped up. And so this is also something that's historic. You see, after and that's what, I have to mention his name, that's what Dewar Bell said. After moments of progress, there are always moments of backlash unless you really understand the history, unless you try to confront what's going on while it's happening and before it's happening. And so there are lots of theories about that. But first of all, I have to tell you, that was just the most excellent presentation on critical race theory that I have heard. And I deal with critical race theory a lot. Mostly I've been an observer because I thought it should be in law schools. All of a sudden it became weaponized, and people who think they know what it is, they're against it. But ask them what it is, and you won't get a rational response.
Yeah, absolutely agree. It's a moment of progress, and as you've said numerous times, as Dr. Bell has said, it's in many ways an adaptation to old forms of racism.
Yeah, we have to be vigilant and always hopeful.
Dr. Andrade?
Well,
Andrade?
I would just add to that. So again, we recognize that there has been a backlash and a response, a reaction, and throughout history, we watched the election of the first black man as president, and the reaction after that was the election of Donald Trump.
Yep. Yes.
And then after he wasn't reelected, there was a doubling down on a backlash that continues to reverberate now. We're at a moment where we're fighting for our voting rights. And so the divisions that are being created by a boogeyman that they've created out of CRT is allowing for this discussion of how do we take books out of schools, how do we make sure parents and teachers aren't doing certain things and dividing and making white students upset. All of this is to make sure that those that are in power can maintain power. And to the answer of why it's critical that we have this discussion tonight, it is to recognize that in the midst of this reaction on an ongoing basis, that we have to make sure that we don't allow our own communities to be bamboozled in the way that they have in the past, that we tell what critical race theory is, what the history that usually isn't told is, and how that relates to this moment in time.
I just want to add, just very briefly, one thing.
Please add, man. As much as possible.
So again, I'm not a lawyer. I don't know anything about the law. I come to this from an education standpoint. The reason why we look at critical race theory in education is because it's built to look at systems, right? It's literally thought of as a way to look at racist systems. And our country is one giant racist machine. And until and unless we look at it, we name it, right? We recognize it, we cannot, like your cancer, the idea of this, how do you take a cancer blind view of treating cancer, right? In education, as you said, it's become a boogeyman. It's become this thing to fear and to malign and to literally burn down, right? And in education, we're not teaching critical race theory. We may be using critical race theory as a lens to look at the system of education, right? But we're not teaching it in K-12 classrooms. Now, should we? Probably, okay? But we're not doing that yet, right? I think part of the problem is we haven't taught it. We haven't taught it in K-12 classrooms. We haven't taught it, I'll say, in our field. We don't teach it as part of education courses, and I think we should. So instead of doing less, I think we should be doing more.
One thing, a quick follow-up is thinking about all of your points you're making about the backlash. It seems like one particular thing that it's also might be a response to is the gains from the protests in summer 2020, which, we have people had a racial awakening like they'd never had before after the murder of George Floyd. And you had a lot of changes in a lot of cities around the world.
Except in Minneapolis.
Except in Minneapolis. and almost after that, it was the fall, basically, of 2020 that we get this really organized movement against race
you
theory.
saw Black Lives Matter signs all over lawns in Weston and all kinds of cities across the state and the country, and then slowly but surely they started to move away. And as those protests went on, we saw that there was different frames in different parts of the news that were calling them thugs and all these other kinds of things. And that anxiety that was being whipped up was trying to make sure that as we move towards a new election and all these kinds of things, we can pit people against each other. The looting that was happening was framed one way. The attack on the Capitol was framed a different way. And so that is the history repeating itself over and over again.
But can I mention something too about the hope? I'm a hope meister. I'm not a lawyer. I don't play one on television. But I was really excited, and other people are, of course, the multiracial, the intergenerational protests that unfortunately the murder of George Floyd sparked here and around the world. And the fact that you have young people who could be doing something else tonight, who are here because you want to learn and you want to know what this is. I think you could take just one of her slides, Dean Onwuachi-Willig's slides, and you have a term paper, just start writing that down. So I'm giving you some hints. I'm also a teacher. But I think that what we have to do is to say that fight against the ignorance, what's so telling about these folks who wanted to develop all of these laws is that they're keeping knowledge away from their own people. It's the banning of books. Once Black people who it doesn't stop with Black people. The discrimination, the authoritarianism attacks does not stop there. It goes throughout the society. So Martin Luther King said, injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. And that's true. So claim your space. I always tell young people that. Claim your space and claim your future. Don't let anyone deny you the opportunity to be the beneficiaries of the great knowledge that's out there, to be the beneficiary of people like Dean Onwuachi-Willig, who can really tell you from a historic, from a societal, from a legal point of view, where we are in terms, and presents things in a way that they're not doctrinaire, that they're asking us to think for ourselves and to engage in civil discourse about it.
So can you tell us a little bit about how has CRT been taken up in each of your different fields, and what do you see as the benefits of employing CRT in your field? I'll start with Dr. Jiménez.
So as I said, right, education is a system. It's a system that is as old as our country. And the system of education in this country is one of resource guarding, right? That's very important to keep in mind. Education in the United States was never meant to open up the world. What it was meant to do was to guard resources and to assimilate people into an idealized American narrative. All right, so once we understand what education is meant to do and we can name it, then we can say, is that what we want, right? And what critical race theory does for education, or for education scholars, it says, what is the alternative? How can I look at, okay, if this is what the education system is meant to do, what is an alternative to that? An alternative to that is, instead of resource hoarding, instead of being designed for white, cisgendered, Christian, male, landowning, English-speaking people, that's what I mean by resource hoarding. Instead of being designed for that, to keep that very small pocket of the United States in power, we can literally open it up. We can open up education systems, and it can become inclusive, right? Now, we don't have that. And we are fighting the wave against that. But critical race theory gives us a way to imagine into an inclusive education system that believes and enacts multiple narratives, multiple histories, critical look at the ways that our country has functioned, and it allows us to illuminate and dream into the way our country can function. Education is at its core future seeking. We are trying to change the ways, and we are attempting to educate, to get people from 5 years old to 24 years old, right? We are always pushing forward. We are future seeking in what we're doing. And that's why critical race theory really, really helps, right? It gives us an idea, ooh, we could do that. We could do that. Ooh, we need to avoid that. What do you got?
In public health, I say almost 8 years ago, when I was then at the Department of Public Health in Massachusetts, we, like many others across the country, were watching Black and brown people harmed using the videos on cell phones that no one could ignore. And we understood then we had to reframe the work that we did. And so we started to train ourselves within certain bureaus of the department, that untold history. What is the things that we haven't known? How do we reframe? And we started then, and now have come to a place where we reframed all our work in the public health department through a racial equity frame. So that means that when we're gathering, analyzing, and reporting data, we recognize that we have to start from the place that this is previously centered in the majority, in the white population. And when we're reporting data, demographic data, that when we have to bring context to that data, when we're reporting data about Black populations, Latinx populations, Indigenous populations, AAPI populations, we have to bring context to that data, because if you recognize that the inequities, the bad outcomes are consistently happening every time you show Black populations as compared to white populations, or Latinic populations compared to white populations, you start to think, well, what's wrong with these populations? Right. We recognized that we had to really refine the way we reported data. We had to refine the way we gave grants out to communities. Grants were going to those that had grant writers to be able to do those grants, while at the same time they didn't have the people that were able to meet the community in the way that they needed to meet. So we slowly but surely understood that we had to center in the margins so that we can address the inequities that are consistently being really just moved forward, but the gaps staying exactly the same. And so we went about finding ways to understand that untold history, to recognize that the context does matter,
right,
and that we have to reframe everything from a whole standpoint. That almost 8 years ago, we weren't saying race. We were forbidden from a state agency to say race. Oh, wow. And now we're to the point where the Secretary of Health and Human Services is saying white supremacy on the stage. So we're making progress at the state agency. At the same time, we still didn't report the data for COVID-19 while it was legislatively mandated, and we weren't putting the data out around where the hot spots were in communities of color. So we made progress, and we have places to go, and it's critical that public health lead the way and recognize that there is a new way to center in the people, and everybody wins when we do that.
And I think it's very important for us to tell stories, to lift up the narrative. The head of the Ford Foundation said the South may have lost the war, but they won the narrative. And when you talk about systemic racism, they really defined what this country was going to be. And we can talk about the various compromises, and from the 3/5 compromise, some of you are familiar with that, of course, and Jim Crow, you mentioned that. But one of the things that I do, I also chair the Women's Media Center, which is a volunteer position. And we believe in naming it, like you said, in naming all, whatever the isms are, in naming what the situation is, because if you don't name it and talk about it, you can't reasonably change it. You do not have a basis for which you can change things. And so I try to, in my writings, to lift up stories. I tell stories of women. I'm a civil rights veteran. I worked in the civil rights movement before most of the people in this room were born, if not all of you. And I was so inspired that people, in the heart of the civil rights movement, which is really the Deep South, I say the civil rights movement was wider than that, but the heart of the civil rights movement were people that you've heard about. John Lewis, who was a child, who was your age when he was active. I mean, he was active his whole life, but who maintained that sense of possibility and hope. And there's a story that he said that needs to be told more. One of the people who beat him almost to death on that bridge when he was crossing the Edmund Pettus Bridge came to Congressman John Lewis's office a few years ago and said, "Something's been bothering me my whole life, and I want to ask you for your forgiveness." He could barely get it out before John Lewis said, "I forgive you," just like that. Because to me, those people who are advocates and who are activists for knowledge of all of us are the ones who carry love. A friend of mine, we were debating how we can talk about critical race theory in an accessible way and in a more popular way that might have people thinking it differently. And we came up with the idea that critical race theory is the language of love. And when you think about it, we are told to love our neighbor as ourselves, no matter what our religion might be. There's some version of that. And how can you do that if you don't respect that person's history, that person's past, that person's struggles? And so that doesn't mean that you. I should feel badly about it. There's another quick story that Brian Stevenson. I love all these wonderful activist people. Brian Stevenson, who started the Equal Justice Initiative and who's dedicated this whole museum to lynching, he sends people out in twos to go to places where people have been lynched, to mark those places. And one woman's partner didn't show up, and she insisted upon going, even though she was by herself. So she goes to this farmland where someone had been lynched. This is within the last few years. And a big truck pulls up, and stereotypical, this big burly white guy gets out of the truck, and she goes, maybe this wasn't one of my better ideas. And he gets out and he says, "What are you doing?" Well, she was told as part of her training to say, "Oh, I'm getting dirt from my garden." But she was so overwhelmed with emotion about where she was and what was happening, she said, "I'm here because I want to mark," and I'm paraphrasing this very, very broadly, "I'm here because I want to mark this is the place where someone was lynched." And the guy said, well, he looked at her and he said, "Well, may I help you?" And he bent down, he said, "This is land my family owned." That's truth and reconciliation. They understood that in South Africa. They understood that in Ireland. They understood that in Germany. In Germany, you can't go 50 feet without seeing something that reminds you of the Holocaust, because never again.
All those things are critical. I mean, very, very important. We need to step back and look at the systems. Context matters, and the narrative winning the narrative war is everything, I think. I mean, just about everything, so it's really important. So all of you have used CRT in different classrooms. So what are the benefits of using CRT in the classroom?
So I feel like, again, it's this idea, it's such a simple, elegant framework that I have a hard time with the idea that it is the boogeyman, right? It's literally saying to us, let's look and examine at power structures. We can't deny that these power structures exist. I mean, okay, we can, but it doesn't make any sense, right? And it just simply says, how do we recognize it? Where do these power structures come from? Where do these contexts grow out of? And then how do we change it? And the wonderful thing about CRT is it says, how do we as individuals, right, function within these systems? How do we change these systems, and how do these systems affect us and change us? In some ways, it's almost non-judgmental. It's not saying I'm good and this person is bad, right? What it's saying is we are all responsible for this system. Now, on a very personal note, right, I think you shall notice there is a little bit of a color variation here. All right, so I refer to myself as a white presenting Latina, right? I'm a white presenting Latina lesbian. Now, chances are when you watch me walk into a room, lesbian is in fact the first thing that comes to your mind. Okay, but otherwise, racially, I look a little, interesting. But nothing really pops out at you. All right, so I understand that I carry this shield of whiteness with me everywhere I go. Right, now my name is Laura Maria Jiménez. That's a different name than what you're expecting when you see this. Critical race theory explains all of my contexts. I carry the visibility of whiteness, and therefore I am protected by it, and I have the responsibility to use that privilege and power to disrupt these systems, right? I hold a different space than any of my African American colleagues do. And I want to make sure we understand that. We are not living the same American expression. We are not living in the same America, right? So for me, that's an incredibly important point to make in the classroom every day.
I think an important part of critical race theory in the classroom starts with the classroom. You know, we have to acknowledge that we are at a historically white-led university. School of Public Health is a historically white-led school. The classrooms that I did my MPH and my DRPH were majority white classrooms. They were white spaces. I never saw a faculty of color in my time in my graduate degrees at the School of Public Health. And so now that we understand that context and the space that we've created, we have a choice to make a different space. We are now at the School of Public Health working to review our curricula from a racial equity lens, from a diversity, equity, inclusion, and justice lens. And in the coming semesters, we'll be putting, we're hoping to put these primers in the beginning of our syllabi that speak to the idea that we invite diversity, equity, and inclusion, that we mean to make multicultural space, And in the classroom that I'm part of, the idea that we start by saying that there is a power dynamic here. And that we, as an instructor, as a professor, and as students can share space and create a brave space, as it were, where we can talk about how if we say something that is harmful, we can say, ouch, or oops, and explain what happened. Everybody learns as a class, and we maintain that space so everybody can be included. Everybody can feel respected and seen. And then we go further by making sure we have case studies that bring in other authors of other perspectives, other colors, other backgrounds, and other experiences, so that people are heard and seen no matter what you look like as a student and who you are as a professor.
There was a story recently about the only critical race theory class taught in the state of Mississippi, which is at the flagship law school at the University of Mississippi. And this story is just so fantastic. This one white student who identifies as conservative, she was head of the Republican council or whatever it was called at her school. And her whole family is conservative. And she was fascinated at all of this talk about critical race theory. But I think what intrigued her was, why are they banning it? Mm-hmm. And so she decided she would enroll in this course, the only course in the state of Mississippi on that's the name, critical race theory. She was interviewed, and she said that it was the most enlightening course that she had, because she found out so many things. She didn't realize that you also discuss such strategies, such as, was school desegregation a good thing or a bad thing? And so she said that the enlightenment, the knowledge that she gained from that course is the single best course she's ever taken at the law school. So that's why I am one of those many instances where it just pushes forward the hope that people aren't going to be, in the community we used to say, don't fall for the okey doke. That means don't fall for the flim-flam person, or don't fall for people who are trying to keep you away from things you need to know about.
Exactly.
Because civilization depends on our increased knowledge, not our decreased knowledge.
Wow. Oh, okay. So really quickly, we have a couple minutes. We'll start with Dr. Dewar Bell. How might CRT help us build and sustain a truly multicultural world?
Oh, okay.
How might CRT?
I think that we look around and we say that if we recognize when there is Black progress, there's progress for everyone. Affirmative action has helped more white women than anybody. It's helped white men, because in the olden days, they would just hire their friends. Then affirmative action had started posting jobs and talk about it. They were intentionally inclusive of women. And you look around, but what happened is, talk about a backlash, it's hard for Black women to get many of those positions. We're still making 2/3 of the salary. So when we talk about structural inequality, people are not bitter about it, but they're righteously angry, and they righteously want to do something about it. So we still have a lot of work to go, but to move forward, it's that we realize that Black progress lifts all boats, and that the benefit of critical race theory is that it's really teaching, in America, American history. And if we don't understand our history, one, we're doomed to repeat the bad things, and we can't build upon the things that have made us still, despite some people's efforts, still a great country.
If we can make African American history, Japanese American history, Mexican American history, then we have a broad story to tell and understand all of where we come from and what we can do. If we can put equity in all policy, then we can talk about how we can kind of find a way to strengthen our communities in all kinds of ways. We have opportunities to really make education, make public health, make health care, all these, make the legal system, the criminal justice system work for all of us. That's when we start moving past the kind of hierarchical issues and think about how all of us can move through to a better place. It's going to take some work, but I think it's the you all as the future that are going to help us get there.
Can I just add one quick thing too, and that's about the economic inequality, not just between people of color and the white society, but the Poor People's Campaign, Poor People's Movement, that tried to organize people. And before that, there were farm workers' unions of farm workers organizing of blacks and whites in the South. And so part of the Jim Crow, when they were trying to push this discrimination, you know, race is a social construct, racism is, they tried to make poor white people feel superior to black people, although they were doing the same job at the same level. And what I say, to maintain that system, you know, there were people who were living high on the hog while they're feeding poor people Jim Crow. And so poor white people have to realize that their interests are really more closely aligned with black people than they are with people who they have protected. They have protected. The overseers were poor white people who oversaw slaves. And that didn't make any sense, right? Because they were in charge of keeping people like them down, but for the color of their skin. And so these kinds of things, you think it's kind of irrational in one sense, but it's so ingrained in how people are taught, the narrative that people are taught. So we have to break through the narrative. We also have to realize that before we get to the place where we can all be Americans, that there's going to be a lot of struggle ahead.
That's why Fred Hampton was seen as so dangerous, because he brought all those people together, poor whites, Latinx, and everybody together in one coalition, and the power structure didn't like that.
Last comment, Dr. Jiménez?
Oh, no, they've done it. There are times when I know to shut up.
Well, thank you all so much. That was really amazing. I learned a lot, and I'm sure people did as well. And we would like to open up to questions from the audience now, and questions from those also who are logging in remotely. So we have one question here.
I believe the mic is coming. Right over here in the purple.
Thank you, everyone. Amazing conversation tonight. And the question that I have is, so having a productive conversation on CRT, I feel that the base assumption is that both parties accept that America is inherently racist. So how do you have a productive conversation about CRT with someone else who doesn't share or won't admit that basic assumption?
I think I'm going to take that one. So I do a lot of reading. I'm a PhD. I'm a complete egghead. And so I try to read widely. I try to read humanities. I try to read stories, right? My scholarship is actually in children's literature, right? I'm really interested in the ways that we tell stories and histories about marginalized communities and individuals, all right? I don't think we can start having this conversation if we don't have a common understanding, which is why it's so important that we bring criticality into K-12 education. If we don't agree that there is gravity, then we cannot agree that when I fall down, I hurt myself, right? If we don't agree that racism exists in the world And maybe we have to start that it's structural racism exists in the world and it's not personal, right? If it's not the personal, maybe we can't start there. But if we can start with that structural piece, right? And we can use data and story and history, right? Then we can have those conversations. We can't start these conversations if we're that far apart, I believe. I may not be as loving or grace-filled as other folk, and I'm okay with that.
Brian Stevens talked about getting proximal to people. The idea that we start with critical race theory is, I think, a wrong place to start. It's starting to get to know the individual and what they're afraid of. Fear is a big tool that is being used in a way that is wedging between our populations. And to get to know that person, to understand what she or he is concerned about or worried about or scared of, is a different place to start, to understand what they're feeling and seeing where that comes from. Down the line, there may be a conversation to recognize that there's something baked into the structure that redlining made it so that certain people were put in certain places and therefore didn't have certain opportunities. But first, it is just starting from the humanity of what we share. That may not always be possible, it may not always be safe. At the same time, starting with critical race theory, the way it's been crafted and the way it's continued to saturate the media, I think there are other places that are just more simple, like humanity.
Yeah, I think that's it's really both really great advice, and I do think that's one way is really sort of understanding where that person's coming from. We all bring our own life experiences and our own lens.
May I say that language matters? So rather than saying, and you hit upon it, Dr. Jiménez, that instead of saying inherent racism, structural racism is a less volatile term, even though it's volatile. But I think that's one way of getting into a conversation because it depersonalizes it.
Yes, I agree too. Yeah. Are there more questions?
Hi, yeah, thank you so much. It's for all of your insights thus far. I was curious, kind of speaking on behalf of students here, but how do you recommend as we enter our entry-level careers that we bring these conversations into a workplace where perhaps the power structures are already so daunting, but we know that these conversations are important?
I think you probably have ways to tell us. I have a nonprofit board, and my youngest member is 25. I tell her she's getting old. She's been on the board since she was 24. And she talks about the courage to have uncomfortable conversations. But she also talks, because she was taught by my co-teacher, about respectful engagement. And that you set bounds and for the conversation, and you engage in you figure out activities in which you can bring forth these kinds of issues so that people talk about it. But I think it's great that you're thinking about that already. That's going into the workplace, and you probably will find an answer that you will then share with us, because we are not young people. Well, I'll speak for myself.
You were correct first time.
Yeah, that's correct. That is correct. I mean, I would say it's all about context. It's about reading the situation. And one thing is, is through personal relationships, right? So the personal relationships you might develop with somebody that you're working with who's part of the executive committee of the workplace that you're at, or one of the decision makers, basically, there. I mean, that it might be that it's easier to do that one-on-one, passing on certain ideas to them or certain questions or insights that might make them think differently and bring those questions to the table. That might be one approach. But you might also be in a workplace that really does encourage that without putting yourself at risk. And so if you're in that particular kind of environment, I would absolutely encourage you to do it. But I think there are all kinds of strategic ways that you could do it. without being the actual person. It's through other people there who are allies or who are certainly on that side and who might have more voice and more clout and power in those spaces, is what I would say.
You know, I was fascinated when I walked into the Thurman Center because I had not really read that quote before. And I was fascinated, his multidisciplinary approach, because I think of Howard Thurman, obviously, as a teacher, a theologian, a great mystic, and what have you. But I think that basis, if we start thinking about creative responses that are multidisciplinary. So for example, we mentioned Brian Stevenson, who is the subject of this movie starring Michael B. Jordan and a lot of, so you may have a movie night. You can do, there's certain things that you can do, trying to achieve common ground. I think if I took a poll, there would not be too many people who would not want to see Michael B. Jordan in something. So Howard Thurman, in trying to teach us about seeking common ground, lived it. And so part of the way for people to approach you is that you have to model the behavior you want other people to have. And that's Nelson Mandela's philosophy. That's many people's philosophy, is that you carry with you the hopes and the dreams. And somehow that opens people up for conversation, I think. That's a little mystical.
There's some practical ways to go about that. You know, more than ever, particularly after the last 2 years we've been through after George Floyd's murder and the COVID-19 and the inequities that it exposed. There are companies all over the country. I've spent a good amount of this last 2 years doing Racial Equity 101 trainings across Zoom in states across the country because companies wanted to have their staff get used to this kind of information and talk first about implicit bias and then about Racial Equity 101. At the Department of Public Health, my previous role, we started with small affinity groups that were getting together, Latinx people getting together, black men getting together, black women getting together, white folks getting together, and then having multicultural kinds of engagements in different ways. So there's organizations like Government Alliance for Racial Equity that are nationwide now trying to promote this kind of thing in the workplace in all kinds of ways. So things are changing, and there's ways to start small and then to go big.
And sometimes you do have to take a risk. The young woman I was mentioning at the University of Mississippi, her friend said, don't draw us into this conversation. Should we even be talking to you about this? And that one of the things that she did when she got the fire, she wrote a letter to the state legislature, and she sent it to all the members of the education committee, saying, why are you trying to do this? Why are you trying to keep learning from us?
I thought, well, one of the suggestions too, suggesting a reading or a book or an article for the whole workplace, which is another good idea. I think someone put there.
Dean Onwuachi, we have a question online.
Yes.
So how is feminist theory connected to critical race theory?
Great question.
So this is probably going to have a different answer for everybody.
Yeah.
So criticality or critical theories have been around for a long time. Feminist theory, by and large, is white, cisgendered feminist theory, but nobody ever talks about that, right? And so it falls under that idea of criticality, in which queer theory exists, intersectionality. Now we have critical disability theory, right? So there's all of these theories that are really necessary, and they have been isolated away from each other, right? So we're going to only talk about feminists, right? Or we're going to talk about queer, and queer theory very often, doesn't cross over into race, right? And instead, we have all of these very, very similar but isolated and disjointed theories working, unfortunately, often working against each other in this idea that, again, There's an empathy hoarding, right? There's a false sense of resource scarcity. Instead of saying, my problems are not that different than your problems, right? And if we work together, maybe we could have less problems, right? And so that idea of bringing together, right? And that's why okay, listen, I love CRT. I love a good CRT chat. I'm banned CRT, but I'm an intersectionalist. In which we look at all of these systems and the way they interconnect and affect, and interconnect and affect differently.
And I would recommend that you read Kimberly Crenshaw's writing on intersectionality. I think that's excellent and give you a good grounding in one part. Mm-hmm. And I have to say that I, along with the former president of Spelman College, who was the brilliant, longtime president of Spelman College, define myself as a Black feminist. By that I mean that when people were saying, oh, you know, saying things that were negative about men, particularly Black men, I said, no, I don't go there. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And so, because I understand that Black men and Black women are in the same boat, and in a way that other people are not. So I have my own intersectionality. So I'm with all of these white feminist groups, but I still define myself as a Black feminist.
What I love about CRT and its nature as a movement, there is right, and in this moment, there's where we reject binary kinds of frames. The Haitian transgender woman in a wheelchair that speaks Haitian is bringing all that literature together and making it her own.
Exactly.
And that's, so there is theory, and then there is the movement, and there is practice. Yes. And there are people that are taking that information from traditional feminist literature to queer literature to liberation theory and all kinds of ways, and they're making it their own, and they're bringing it into the world in a whole new way. And that's the future of where we're going.
Absolutely, absolutely. The disjointed nature of theory and the disjointed nature of specialization that academia fosters is, we are working against the critical race theory movement, right? We are territorializing. Right, we are colonizing, for lack of a better term. We are colonizing ideals and paradigms and ideology instead of bringing it together and figuring out how we can best work together, again, in order to raise all of us.
Onwuachi, if we can have another question, because this came in many times. How would you approach a conversation with beloved friends and family members who do not believe in critical race theory?
I mean, I think the context also matters, right? I mean, it's about how do you reach the person knowing where they're coming from. So, you know, I have a friend that I often disagree with who, you know, who is open to learning, and I'm open to learning for them, learning from them as well. But I have to remind myself often, this was somebody when we were growing up, couldn't have Black friends, right? So that's the space at which you're coming from. And so I'm gonna approach conversations and discussions and debates with her in a different way than I would with somebody who didn't have that background. And so I think it's all contextual, it would be my approach. But I guess one way to, an opening for approaching is to say, well, to ask them, do you know what critical race theory is? And if they can't define it, and say, well, that's one of the powers of this movement against it, is that so many people have been turned away from it before they've even had a chance to understand it. And maybe we should step back and think about why it's been able to take launch in that way, despite the fact that people don't understand it. there are a variety of ways to approach it, but I think it really does depend on the person and the context.
I would listen more. that seek first to understand, then to be understood. 7 Habits of Highly Effective People. Listen a whole lot. And then once you feel like you can repeat what this person understands, and they're shaking their heads, then they may be able to listen to you.
I just had a quick question. I don't know if this is. Hi. So last year in the BU pre-law review, I wrote an article about the push for mandating anti-racist training in all accredited law schools, which I know you were a part of the Anti-Racist Clearinghouse Project, which I also talked about as well. And it made me think, I know anti-racism is a little bit of an offshoot of critical race theory, but it's making me thinking about what is the place of CRT in administrative work and in higher education administrations, because we've talked a lot about the backlash that's been in a lot of K through 12 spaces, but what are the challenges and dynamics that are different in higher education compared to K-12 spaces regarding CRT?
I think there are a lot of dynamics that help to reproduce. I mean, I think CRT, if you are a leader, you can understand the ways in which we continue to reproduce particular ways of teaching and operating that can exclude and repeatedly exclude. It might reveal, I mean, it's from everything from the way that, the fact that I think it's good the faculties govern everything, but I think that also the narrow criteria that we tend to look at when we're hiring faculty means that generally those people are thinking along a particular kind of line about what education should look like and what it should be like, and so we continue to reproduce the same kind of systems in that way. I mean, there's so many things around it, and I think if you bring a critical lens to it, you can see all of those ways, and sometimes it can help strategically in trying to create change. But it's really hard. One thing that you understand as a critical race theorist, it's really hard to affect broad-scale change by yourself because the structures are so deep and so intense and so hard to overturn. It's decades and decades and decades of work. That's what I would say.
I'm involved with several educational institutions, and they often have, well, now there's this growing need to establish diversity, equity, and inclusion committees, and there's some that really work, and then sometimes they're just checking the box. And in an organization that only has people of color, you'll have a meeting and they'll have committees, and then they'll say, okay, for that committee, and they want all the people of color to be on that committee. I said, no. That committee needs to show diversity, equity, and inclusion. It needs to represent everybody. You're not going to, there are times when you do have to have affinity groups, no question about that. But if you are in a business or another kind of organization or an educational institution, it's important to think of how you model what you want the institution to become.
Dean Onwuachi, if we can take another one online. Does critical race theory examine or include other races like Asians or Hispanic?
Well, of course. I mean, critical race theory is a lens, analytical frame for looking at racism in general, which includes really all racial groups. It's about understanding whiteness as well. Exactly. It's about understanding all of those things, absolutely.
I would like to say, I think this is something that comes up a lot. Right. This idea that critical race theory is really about Blackness. And there are areas of Black study, right? There's Afrocentric Black study centers. We have an African American, we have an African studies major here. We have all of that. But it is not about Black folks. critical race theory is really about white power structures, right? That's where racism lay, right? It began when the Spaniards decided to start committing genocide on indigenous communities all up and down the American continent. It started when folks decided to go and steal artists and philosophers and mothers and fathers and enslave them as property, right? This idea of racism has an enormously long history in our country, as long as our country, right? I will say, I got some time and I started reading Dewar Bell's work because I thought, ooh, I need like a little, CRT primer. And I'm sure he's got a little CRT 101 that I can just download and I can read and I'll be good. And what I found was I sort of stumbled on his work on Brown versus Board of Education.
Yes.
Right? And I was like, oh, I know that. Okay. And what I didn't realize is that in that incredible argument, he used, which I thought nobody knew about, right? He used a case that happened in California. The Mendez case in California was about education segregation for Chicanos, for Mexican Americans. That was the basis. That was the established law, one of the established law cases that was used for the Supreme Court case, right? Brown versus Board of Education. And people always think that's only about the black folks. It's not. Literally, the rationale came from a case in California about Mexicans being denied equal education opportunities, right? It's never about one.
And I wanted to mention something about the slave trade, and that is that the slave traders specifically got people who were skilled, not just artists, they got engineers, agriculturalists who came over and who built the South. That's why cotton was king. That's why you had peanuts. You just started the sugarcane trade. So it was very intentional in the enslavement of Africans in this country. And we sometimes forget that. In New York, where I live, I'm not very popular at dinner. You talk about unconscious when I remind people, when they're talking about those people elsewhere, people always try to point a finger. I don't point fingers. I try to point out the history and the facts. And I say, you realize, of course, that New York City had slaves. And they go, no, we didn't. I said, yes, the African burial ground, that's because there were Africans who were working here as slaves. So you have to know who built this country. When I first heard the MAGA, I was so silly. I heard the phrase, make America great again. I said, oh my goodness, they're talking about the Cherokee, the Iroquois, the Micmac. I was so excited they're really going to acknowledge indigenous people. And someone said, Janet, please.
Sorry. I think there's a question back here.
So my question is for Dr. Bell. I was wondering if you could speak to the relationship between Howard Thurman and Dewar Bell, and how, if maybe there was some way that Howard Thurman may have helped shape or impart some wisdom on Dewar Bell.
That's a very good question. Well, Dewar Bell happened to know Howard Thurman. He was on the board after Reverend Dr. Thurman died of the Thurman Center in California, I believe. And Derek was always a very spiritual person, although he was not necessarily a person who went to church all the time. He always had faith. And so over the years, we went to a church, an intentionally diverse congregation in New York City. We have everybody. You name the race, you name the gender, you name whatever. We even have, it's supposedly a Presbyterian church. They almost kicked us out of the presbytery because we were advocating for gay rights 20 years ago, and they were like, excuse us. Took them a while to catch up with us, but we did that. But the pastor, the senior minister there, was also on the Howard Thurman Center board, and that's how he and Derek met. Derek became very more attentive about going to church. In fact, his last trade press book, Ethical Ambition, has a chapter in it on evolving faith, and there's a really indirect part that his relationship and his knowledge of Howard Thurman contributed to that. I mean, we talked about the dispossessed. We talked about, our pastor would talk about the deep calling to the deep. Our pastor would talk about the fact that Howard Thurman not only taught people by his words, but by the life that he lived. And that's the way Derek was always about that. But I think the deepening sense of how he could live his life was, there's a lot of Howard Thurman there.
Hello. I just had a question in regards to, at the beginning of Dean Onwuachi's presentation, about essentialism. Mm-hmm. And you gave the example of when you think of someone in the civil rights movement, you think of a male, a black male. And then you said there are some positives to essentialism. And so I was trying to imagine what some of those positives might be. So I don't know if you could give me more insight on that.
Yeah, so what I mean is that, there's a broad diversity, right, of people. You use Black Americans, right? There's a broad diversity among Black Americans, and you could talk about the various intersections. But sometimes, if you're forming a movement and you're organizing around a particular issue, it can help to be essentialist in terms of getting people to all join around and jump into a coalition and move forward on a particular issue, right? So, I mean, you want to always be aware of the fact that you're being essentialist, but sometimes essentialism is what brings people together, right? And that's what I meant by that. Like, if you're really forming a movement, sometimes you need a little bit of essentialism, or you need a little bit of a sense of linked fate, or a connection, right? Or something that everybody is kind of, coalescing around. And so I meant that it's not all bad, although you always want to, of course, be aware of the way in which you're being essentialist. Does that make sense? Are there more questions? Well, thank you all so much. Thank you to amazing panel. Thank you. Thank you.
Wow, that was just absolutely fantastic. Let's give them another round of applause. Thank you so much. Once again, I really would like to thank everyone who joined us here today and also virtually this evening, and a huge thank you to the village that it takes to put an event like this together, starting with the Howard Thurman Center for hosting us, to BU Productions, CART, and the ASL interpreters for making our event accessible to all members of our community. And of course, I'd like to thank our wonderful panelists again for thoughtfully engaging in tonight's conversation. I also, if I could take the privilege of being the janitor, co-creator of this event, to say that I had, as many of you know, the privilege and the experience of spending 5 years directing a civil rights museum in Birmingham, Alabama. and living in part of the country that I had never lived before. I actually was born in Cambridge, Massachusetts, just across the river. And I can only tell you that throughout this conversation, what was running through my mind is what a disservice this country has done academically in not training and teaching the history of this country, the full American history. And at the museum every day, I would wander through the galleries and talk to visitors. We had tens of thousands of visitors every year, and would meet people from all over the world. They came from around the globe to see and hurry here and learn more about the history in Birmingham. And I would see people weeping. We had tissue boxes available. We all had volunteers who would bring comfort when people saw the images of lynching. And we have a KKK robe on display, and people would see these symbols and they would learn about things that, as grown men and women, they had never heard about most of the history that we were preserving and telling at that institution. And and they would weep. They were just overcome. And when you think about the fact that there still isn't a common curriculum in history, the history of all of America out there, and people don't know these stories, and ergo, it makes it harder to understand critical race theory if you don't know the history. So I just share that to say that hopefully this group and others will begin to look at the full American story because it will uplift and enlighten and I think empower people to bridge these gaps that we're talking about. The other thing, just as a point of privilege, I was a freshman in the last year of Howard Thurman's tenure as Dean of Chapel. So there are people in the room that are probably older than you are, Janet, but it was, and I had the good sense to get up every Sunday morning from my dorm on Bay State Road in the Towers and go hear him because he was just a powerful spirit and an amazing man. So this has been a wonderful, wonderful opportunity, and we hope that everyone will walk away with a nuanced understanding of a topic that has become a lightning rod in many communities for examining issues of race and power, policy, and leadership. And while our focus on this event was education on critical race theory and its impact on society, we recognize that there are diverse perspectives on this scholarship. And in the coming weeks, what our office will be doing is sharing a list highlighting a spectrum of scholarship and views that you can read and further engage with the framework. And we will also be asking for feedback on what you have experienced here today so that we want you to look out for our mail that will be coming and really let us know what you thought of this event, whether this kind of programming would be of future interest, and know that we would be delighted to come and talk with you in whatever context, if you're a faculty or a student or a staff person. And we really do want to hear from you. And so, as we all heard, critical race theory can often feel more divisive than unifying. And the more informed people are, it helps to move the dialogue and the response in a way that is positive and impactful today and in the future. We really hope that this panel has empowered you to discover ways to have complex conversations, difficult conversations, when there is not always a uniform consensus, and find common ground in a respectful and inclusive way. Again, thank you all for participating, the panel and the audience and those in the virtual community. Thank you, thank you, thank you. Have a wonderful evening.